Whether we talk about the olden days of fighting games where looping throws in a shady arcade would get you murdered, or the present era of fighting games where looping throws is a legitimate high-level strategy, one thing that genre diehards will be familiar with is the humble fighting game port. In order to expand on a game's audience, developers will often release a specialized version for a completely different system. As the results range from awesome to borderline unplayable, I thought it would be interesting to examine some of the most bizarre fighting game ports, understanding why they're so confusing in the first place. By the way, even though some of what we'll be covering today is truly horrible, bizarre doesn't necessarily equal bad. It just refers to ports that, regardless of quality, make you scratch your head and think, how in the world is this real? With a preamble out of the way, prepare to be puzzled as we explore some of the most bizarre fighting game ports. Let's be honest, Street Fighter 2 doesn't need an introduction, as everybody and their grandmother knows who and what a Ryu is, especially when he's in front of that beautiful Suzaku castle. Goodness, I love Japan. But what you might not be aware of is Street Fighter 2 on DOS. When I first heard about it, I remembered X-Men Children of the Atom's DOS port and how it's not actually that bad. Sure, the audio compression sounds like when I screw around in Audacity, but the gameplay and art style aren't bad at all. It functions far better than you might expect. With this in mind, I went into Street Fighter 2's DOS port with confidence, knowing that there was real potential for it to be a lot of fun. It's horrible. Before we even get into a match, just look at how badly they butchered the intro movie. The guy on the right is missing half his body, and the music. Oh man, don't get me started on the music. It sounds like a swarm of bees who were given honey laced with Adderall. Speaking of audio, there's a setting to turn the music off and only keep the sound effects, but this is arguably worse. It sounds like CIA audio torture. Anyway, you know how the regular Street Fighter 2 has 6 attack buttons? Well, its DOS cousin strips that down to 1, leaving players with a singular button that handles both punches and kicks. Of all the wonderful keys on a standard keyboard, the developers chose the enter button for your attacks, with the arrow keys for movement. Trying to jump will shoot your fighter into the sky, and this reminds me of the old Tekken and Virtua Fighter moon jumps. I have no idea why any of these decisions were made, considering, you know, keyboards have enough buttons to make the regular control scheme work, but it seriously hinders any potential fun factor this game may have had. Aside from woeful controls and audio, the visuals aren't the best either. Character sprites are large with decent attention to detail, but their animation is some of the choppiest I've ever seen in the genre. Unlike the original game, where characters would noticeably recoil alongside a slow motion effect when taking big damage, the DOS port throws this out the window and instead speeds the animations up, leading to matches feeling frantic, and never in a good way. There's zero impact to any of your actions here, and before you can even visually process what's just taken place, another 5 attacks have been sent flying your way. Hit detection also leaves much to be desired, as attacks will sometimes phase through the opponent for no good reason. You can never tell when and where strikes will connect, ruining any sense of consistency found in Street Fighter 2's arcade release. All of this is pretty terrible, but the cherry on top of the sundae are the loading screens. Every time a battle is about to begin, you're forced to wait through a 20-second long load time. I suspect that early 90s PCs weren't capable of instantly loading the game's assets after the versus screen, but that doesn't make the wait any less painless. I genuinely thought my emulator crashed during my very first playthrough. With that said, I couldn't even bring myself to finish that playthrough. The horrible sound, controls, and loading times are bad enough on their own, but when combined, they lead to an exercise in the macabre, and not in a fun way where being scared is part of the appeal. To be honest, I try to find a silver lining in whatever I play, even if I know the game isn't objectively good, but I genuinely can't find anything commendable about this DOS port. I guess it's cool that you can play with another person on the same keyboard, but with that said, if you like someone enough to invite them over to your place, then you most likely wouldn't want to torture them with choppy guile animations. Outside of arcade and versus modes, there's nothing to do here, so the initial appeal of playing a wacky fighting game port wears off almost instantly. On a lighter note, the game's box art tries to make it seem like the coolest thing on the planet, which I find hilarious. Overall, we've started off with an absolute dumpster fire of a fighting game conversion, so let's see if things get any better going forward. My original plan was to cover Mortal Kombat 3 on the Sega Master System, as just by looking at it for 5 seconds, it's obvious that the poor console can barely run the game. But then I found something even stranger. After breaking records and taking names in 1993, Mortal Kombat 2 was ported to a variety of platforms, including the Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis, but it was also released on the PS1. This in itself isn't too bizarre, as plenty of fighters made their way to Sony's console, until you realize that this PS1 port was exclusively released in Japan 3 years after its initial arcade launch. At this point in time, Ultimate Mortal Kombat 3 was out, MK Trilogy was only months away from releasing, and Japan was still extremely strict about censoring violent content in media, so I'm not convinced that any fledgling fighting game fans would have spent their yen on this game. I did, and much to my surprise, Mortal Kombat 2 on PS1 isn't too bad. It's not perfect, mind you, as there are countless loading screens even during a match, but it plays okay. All the iconic Mortal Kombat special moves and fatalities show up here, and I didn't notice any frame rate issues either, so what gives? Why is this port so bizarre? Well, MK2 on PS1 is one of those cases where the circumstances surrounding its release shrouds it in this air of mystery. Delayed release dates aside, the port's presentation style and menus feel noticeably unfinished. Character names and descriptions often render outside of their boundaries, the loading screens are as basic as can be, and the main menu is extremely bare, not even containing a versus mode. Stage visual effects are also misaligned, with the living forests screaming trees having sprite layering issues when animating. When scrolling through the game options, you're treated to a 5-second loop of droning ambience, and this kind of creeped me out a little bit. There's no other music in these menus. The settings themselves range from basic to oddly specific, such as enabling the announcer's name calls. I don't know why this isn't just a default part of the game, but okay. Also, for a Japanese exclusive port, I didn't find any Japanese text. It's common for their games to contain English text here and there, but even the paragraphs upon paragraphs of important story context remain untranslated. Now you might be thinking that a menu as paltry as this would be unacceptable for a retail release at full price, but if you input a cheat code during the intro movie, 2 extra options become available. Switches function as gameplay modifiers, allowing you to alter damage values, fatality requirements, and the frequency of the iconic toasty Easter egg, just to name a few. The most interesting one, however, is artful scaling, with artful spelt incorrectly. That's quite the tasteful adjective, even if its impact is anything but. Like with the old school art of fighting games, the camera's zoom value changes in real time as fighters move around the screen, but to be honest, this gives me motion sickness. In fact, the whole game gives me motion sickness, and I'm not entirely sure why. I can play any other version of MK2 just fine, so there's gotta be something specifically on the PS1 that's offending my eyeballs. Soak Test is the final feature, and this is quite the confusing name. I had no idea what Go Soak meant when I was first experimenting with its options, but it's simply a demo screen where 2 CPU characters battle it out. When playing through arcade mode, I immediately noticed that the enemies are a far cry from the input-reading demons we've grown accustomed to over the years. Unlike its arcade version, MK2 can easily be beaten by spamming the right special moves. Try to perform a flying high kick with Liu Kang and the CPU will duck underneath it every time, but Sub-Zero's ice ball will never be defended against. The enemy's programming kind of breaks against certain characters, and if you know who to select, clearing the game is a breeze. Finally, the credits display is one of the funniest sequences I've ever seen in a game. Unlike most video games, where you're treated to a simple scrolling display of developer names, this port treats you to low-quality screenshots and nicknames of its creators. The Maggot Man is one of my favorites, as well as this guy who reminds me of Harry Potter mixed with Ted Bundy. Man, this is gold. On a surface level, Mortal Kombat 2 on PS1 seems like your stock standard 90s fighting game port that wouldn't grab your attention if you walked by him on the street. But in reality, it's a bizarre concoction of frequent loading times, silly Easter eggs, and nightmare-inducing ambience. Remember when SNK were releasing King of Fighters games for the Game Boy Advance? Yeah. I do too. It turns out that the King of Fighters EX2 Howling Blood, say that 5 times fast, was ported to Nokia's N-Gage system in 2005 by Hudson Soft under the name of the King of Fighters Extreme. I'm not sure how you would ever play a fighting game on this behemoth with any sense of accuracy, but maybe it's easier than it seems? I spent hours trying to set up ECAL-A2L1, the most popular N-Gage emulator for Windows PCs, but just wasn't able to find the necessary files. Additionally, KOF Extreme isn't listed as playable on the emulator's compatibility list, meaning that even if I could run the game, there would be severe issues. For this reason, I'll be using external footage from other creators, and links to their videos will be in the description. From what I can tell, EX2's entire character roster and striker system made their way into Extreme, which is quite the achievement. Their movements aren't bad either, as despite some removed animation frames, it doesn't make me want to rip my eyeballs out, automatically making it better than Street Fighter 2 on DOS. Old reviews state that every move and combo found in the original GBA version can be performed with greater accuracy on the N-Gage, mostly due to its greater button layout. Macros for dodge rolls and multiple button presses are bound by default for ease of access, with general input reading working perfectly fine. Hell, you can even play multiplayer via Bluetooth connectivity. This wasn't anything mind-blowing in the grand scheme of things, as all sorts of early 2000s handhelds had this feature, but it's still really cool to have. There are even cutscenes that pop up during an arcade mode run to flesh out the game's narrative, which is a neat little detail I'm glad was kept. So far, KOF Extreme seems like quite the stand-up fighting game port, one that I would allow my daughter to go to prom with, but I'd be lying if I said there weren't some glaring issues. For starters, the game's audio is highly compressed with background music that fails to loop properly. It simply fades out before rapidly fading in again, sounding super jarring every time. Sound effects sometimes fail to play too, and it leads to attacks losing their sense of impact. There's nothing like throwing out a big special move only for its audio file to be AWOL, and I wonder why this happens. Also, this next point is a bit nitpicky, but I noticed that there was no breathing room after a fight. Remember that awesome slow motion fade to white after finishing a battle in the earlier King of Fighters games? That is present here, sure, but it's been sped up to the extreme, leading to a win quote that's barely on the screen for 3 seconds before you go on to the next stage. The juxtaposition between a fast-paced battle that keeps you engaged and the win screen's cooldown period has been butchered with his speed increase. But look, in reality, it's such a minor detail that I doubt will bother many players, so it's really not a huge issue that makes me hate the game or anything like that, you know. However, I can't say the same for Extreme's performance, as after reading reports that severe framerate drops occur from time to time, I started to notice something a bit strange. Upon taking a deeper look at the game, its framerates began to look a little weird. After spending countless days and nights doing research alongside the world's finest investigators, I found a GameSpot review claiming that on the best of days, the game runs at 15 frames a second. Yes, 15. Trying to play an executionally demanding series like KOF at sub 20 frames a second sounds like a nightmare, but who knows, maybe the game feels better than it looks. Even with Extreme's technical issues, it reviewed decently well and earned a comfy spot in the Museum of Obscure King of Fighters history. Unfortunately, attempting to get your mitts on the title nowadays is far easier said than done, and I wish I was able to experience Extreme for myself. If you're one of the lucky few who still own an N-Gage and can load games onto it, maybe you should try the game out. Even if you don't like it, on the bright side, you'll be able to flex on the rest of us mere mortals who aren't cool enough to have one of these beasts in our possession. Marvel vs. Capcom 2 is a work that I've discussed many times over the years on the channel, including its often forgotten ports. I've even made an entire video covering this very topic, but aside from the conventional Dreamcast, PS2, and Xbox ports that everybody knows, there's something far more peculiar that has fallen out of the Marvel fanbase's collective consciousness. Released 12 years after tagging its way into arcades, and for the low price of $4.99, Marvel 2 was ported to iOS devices, requiring the legendarily futuristic iOS 5 in order to run the game. Unlike other mobile fighters from the 2010s where motion inputs and fully realized movement had been replaced with simple taps and swipes, Marvel 2 on mobile was a full port of the Dreamcast version, containing all 56 playable fighters, a training mode, and fully animated 3D stages. To make the game's battle system fit onto smartphones, Capcom introduced a brand new control scheme and combo system, and it's pretty wild. Punch, kick, special moves, and tags are relegated to their own unique buttons, with special functioning like Super Smash Bros., where inputting it alongside a direction would lead to a different special move. Doing the same with the assist button can lead to crossover counters and team supers, and it's awesome that Capcom figured out ways to include every last mechanic into this iOS conversion. Even the most basic of combos underwent significant changes, as normals can now be infinitely repeated. In any other version of Marvel 2, pressing Light Punch for example, 2 times in a row will give you a simple light into medium combo, with button mashing repeating this sequence on a cycle. Sounds simple, right? Well, if you attempt this in the iOS port, you'll find that normals can freely chain into themselves forever. You can even use them for extended block strings, and even though it's been over a decade since I last played this port, I remember this feature changing how characters would approach a battle. No longer do you need TAS-level execution for ridiculous solo combos, as you can now mash part of your phone's touchscreen. This allows for otherwise impossible combos, and even though it's far from being competitively viable, it never fails to simultaneously puzzle and amaze me. In another interesting move, you still have to grind through the secret factor mines in order to unlock every character. Although there are some people who actually enjoyed doing this on their smartphones, I can't imagine it would be nice on your hands in the long run. As a portable title, Marvel 2 iOS lends itself to short bursts of entertainment, so if you really wanted to have the full character roster, you would have to spend hours, and maybe even days of your life throwing out Hadokens on a tiny iPhone screen. On the bright side, the characters themselves animate nicely despite their change in resolution. While I can't test this out for myself for reasons I'll cover shortly, I remember the PS2 port having balance changes due to fighter sprites rendering at an incorrect resolution, and with how they've been squished down for smartphones, I'm going out on a limb and assuming a similar phenomenon occurred for the iOS port. Aside from its fully realized content suite, the game's performance can be lackluster depending on what device you were using. Older iPhone models would run into frequent frame rate drops as they simply didn't have the processing power required to render all of Marvel 2's colorful graphical assets, whereas a GigaChad iPad could handle them just fine. It's understandable why this is the case, but I do remember running into slowdown when I would play the game on my dad's old work phone way back in the day. The biggest tragedy of them all, however, is that Marvel 2 iOS was delisted alongside its PS3 and Xbox 360 brethren. Even if this didn't happen, Apple stopped supporting 32-bit apps from iOS 11 onwards, so even if you could still buy the game, it wouldn't be able to run on any modern phone. But what about Android? I hear some of you green text bubble aficionados ask, but it turns out that Marvel 2 was never released for that operating system. Perhaps this was due to technical issues or a licensing agreement between Capcom and Apple, but whatever the case may be, you'll need an iPhone or iPad to run the game files. This makes it nearly impossible for the average person to play the Marvel 2 smartphone port in today's era, but with how technology has rapidly advanced since its release, I'm pretty sure you'd be able to run the Dreamcast version on most phones nowadays. Also, if you own a Steam Deck or Switch, then you can play it via the Marvel Collection, but for those of you who are determined to experience this long-forgotten version of Marvel 2 specifically, I wish you the best of luck. At this point, it's clear that not every one of these ports are home runs, but at least their developers tried to make something playable, I'll give them that. With the exception of Marvel 2 iOS, I had no idea that these ports existed, and being able to analyze their contents for the video was good fun. Not being able to access these games on real hardware takes away some of their magic, but I would rather play them on emulators than not play them at all. You hear that, KOF Extreme? I'll track you down one day. I haven't made a video covering bizarre fighting game ports before, and if you would like to see more in the future, feel free to let me know in the comments. There's an ocean's worth of content for me to swim through when discussing this topic, and I'm sure that I could find even more weirdo versions if I look hard enough. Anyway, Street Fighter 2 on DOS has committed war crimes on my eyes and ears, so I'm gonna check myself into the nearest hospital to not go blind or deaf. If you made it all the way to the end of the video, thank you so much for watching. I appreciate you and your time, and I hope you had fun. Take care, and I'll see you in the next one.